TRACEN Attach Hoot!
On the morning of September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people from 93 nations lost their lives in New York, at the Pentagon, and on Flight 93. This morning we pause to remember that moment of horror and to pray for those left scarred by those terrible events. Would you please join with me in prayer, followed by a moment of silence as we reflect and remember those who gave the ultimate sacrifice. Let us pray. Dear God, as we gather together this morning, we take a moment to remember the tragedy and to honor the lives that were lost on September 11, 2001. For the wounds that were cut so deep, for the lives forever changed, we ask, Lord, that you would be the comfort and peace to those who are so deeply affected, to those who suffered the loss of loved ones. Now please join me in a moment of silence until the first call to close.
Halt. Inward. Face. And salute. Ready, two. Outward. Face.
Halt. Chief Warhawk, that was executed properly and on time.
Very well. Carry on. Outward. Face.
Today we gather to commemorate the nearly 3,000 people, including more than 400 first responders, who lost their lives on the morning of September 11th, 2001. 14 years ago on this day, a group of terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and flew them into the World Trade Center, New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a 4th plane suspected to be headed for the White House was overtaken by passengers and crashed in Pennsylvania. On that day, our nation was stunned, but in the face of this horror, many courageous Americans responded to save the injured, evacuate those in danger, and protect the public from further attack. On that morning and in those difficult months that followed, our Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard was Vince Patton III. He saw firsthand those recovery efforts and the transformation of the Coast Guard as we know it today. And for many of you all, the only Coast Guard you've ever known. I'm truly honored and humbled to introduce him as our guest speaker today. Master Chief Patton served as the 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard from May 1998 until his retirement for more than 30 years of service in November of 2002. What many of you may not know is that Master Chief Patton started his career as a radioman right here, attending Radioman A School at TRACEN Petaluma, going on to have an illustrious career in the Coast Guard as well as beyond. We are proud to have him here today as our guest speaker for this observance, as well as a guest speaker for our future operations specialist at an A School graduation this morning. Master Chief Patton.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. To staff, members, and crew of Training Center Petaluma, to the A School students here, thank you so much for having me here today. You know, when I was asked to do this, and this is a very emotional day for me as it is for many of us, and particularly for those who still wear the uniform in terms of doing and supporting the Constitution of the United States. I'm reminded of something that may be a little odd that I'm gonna say. From Aztec shore to Arctic zone, to Europe and Far East, our flag is flying by our ships in times of war and peace. And never have we struck it yet in spite of foeman's might, who cheered our crews and cheered again for showing how to fight. We're always ready for the call. We place our trust in thee. Through surf and storm and howling gale, high shall our purpose be. Semper Paratus is our guide, our fame, our glory too. To fight to save or fight to die, I, Coast Guard, we are for you.
detail. Halt. How about ice? Tracen, stand at peace. All out, gather around. A school students to the front.
Come on up, guys. Come on, up.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Today we gather to commemorate the nearly 3,000 people, including more than 400 first responders, who lost their lives on the morning of September 11th, 2001. 14 years ago on this day, a group of terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and flew them into the World Trade Center, New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a 4th plane suspected to be headed for the White House was overtaken by passengers and crashed in Pennsylvania. On that day, our nation was stunned, but in the face of this horror, many courageous Americans responded to save the injured, evacuate those in danger, and protect the public from further attack. On that morning and in those difficult months that followed, our Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard was Vince Patton III. He saw firsthand those recovery efforts and the transformation of the Coast Guard as we know it today. And for many of you all, the only Coast Guard you've ever known. I'm truly honored and humbled to introduce him as our guest speaker today. Master Chief Patton served as the 8th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard from May 1998 until his retirement for more than 30 years of service in November of 2002. What many of you may not know is that Master Chief Patton started his career as a radioman right here, attending Radioman A School at TRACEN Petaluma, going on to have an illustrious career in the Coast Guard as well as beyond. We are proud to have him here today as our guest speaker for this observance, as well as a guest speaker for our future operations specialist at an A School graduation this morning. Master Chief Patton.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Clausen, thank you very much. To staff, members, and crew of Training Center Petaluma, to the A School students here, thank you so much for having me here today. You know, when I was asked to do this, and this is a very emotional day for me as it is for many of us, and particularly for those who still wear the uniform in terms of doing and supporting the Constitution of the United States. I'm reminded of something that may be a little odd that I'm gonna say. From the Aztec shore to Arctic zone, to Europe and Far East, our flag is flying by our ships in times of war and peace. And never have we struck it yet in spite of foeman's might, who cheered our crews and cheered again for showing how to fight. We're always ready for the call. We place our trust in thee. Through surf and storm and howling gale, high shall our purpose be. Semper Paratus is our guide, our fame, our glory too. To fight to save or fight to die. I, Coast Guard, we are for you. Now, of course, most, not all of you, recognize the lyrics to our service song, Semper Paratus. And it was on this day in 2001 that our service really meant being always ready. Imagine the fact we had to get over 3 million people off of Manhattan Island. That task fell on the tiniest service of our nation and carried it out responsibly and flawlessly. And having the opportunity, a very sad opportunity at that, to have gone to all 3 ground zeros, the Pentagon, the World Trade Center in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and seeing firsthand of the destruction that happened. Surprisingly, the first thing that came to my mind was our service song. And I hummed that song over and over and over again during that time as I smelled the stench of the smoke and seeing the destruction. And yes, even seeing parts of bodies. Why did Semper Paratus, the song, come to me? Because it reminded me of the fact that what our service is all about and what our country is all about. About that when times are of a disaster of this nature, we are always ready for the call. And we are always ready to do the things that we have to do and place our life on the line. The legacy of our service to people who have done that. As you wear that proud uniform, and for those of you international services who serve with your countries as well, you take on that legacy. And that's what happened to me on September 11th, 2001. I also want to share with you probably one of the most spiritual moments that happened to me over the course of that time. I mentioned to you that I had been to all 3 ground zeros, all within a matter of days. Smoke still smoldering. In fact, fires are still going. Recovery operations of finding body pieces and so forth was still happening. I'm reminded of when I went to New York about 6 days after the World Trade Center destruction. Actually, I had been there like 24 hours after, but actually walking on ground zero was about 6 days after. As we walked around in the area of seeing the destruction and debris, there was this tiny church that sat on Rector Street in downtown Manhattan, just blocks from where the World Trade Center once stood. Everything around that church was destroyed beyond recognition, except for this church, Trinity Church. The graveyard of Trinity Church has our founding father of our Coast Guard, Alexander Hamilton, as well as several other former secretaries of Treasury, Gallatin, Morgenthau, Dallas. When we walked over by that church, the first thing I was astonished by the fact that looking at all the destruction around and then seeing this tiny church, and it is a very tiny church, which I've always found that odd having my 2 tours in Washington, D.C. and New York and seeing that church among all of those large buildings and so forth still standing. Admiral Lloyd, who was coming out of the Coast Guard at the time, looked at me and he said, "Master Chief, I want you to assemble a work party to come over and clean this place up." Now, I looked at him a little strangely because with everything that was going on, that I just thought that from a list of priorities, cleaning up this church, I know it has to be done, but boss, aren't there other things we had to do? But I didn't question it because I looked into his eyes at the time he asked me that. And I saw this feeling of hope that he had. And I took on that responsibility. I contacted the command Senior Chief Cole, who was back then it was called Activities New York, now called Sector New York. And I called him up and I said, "Senior Chief, I need your help. The Commandant wants Trinity Church yard cleaned up." And he says, "Yes, Master Chief." He says, "When do you want to start?" "Now." He says, "But Master Chief, I don't think we can get over there yet." I said, "Well, the way he told me was now. So whatever hoops that has to be taken, let it happen. And then anything that needs to have any ways paid, give me a call. Either I or I will have Admiral Lloyd clear that path for you." So in just a couple of days, Senior Chief Cole assembled about 40 people and went over to this tiny churchyard. The next day, actually, let me tell you about this church. I'll tell you how destructive it was. There was debris, tons of debris all over the place. Ashes. And who knows what else was there. It literally would have taken a couple of hundred people to clean that up. But see, she's got 40 people. Brought them over there. And what I thought was going to be about a week to 2 weeks long to do, about just my own visual observation of how that churchyard looked, I figured I wouldn't hear from them for at least a couple weeks. I was back in Washington, D.C. the day after the senior chief marched 40 people over to the graveyard of Trinity Church, and we started to clean up. I get a phone call from Senior Chief Cole the next day. He said, Master Chief, I need you to come back up here. Now, planes weren't flying then, so there was no easy way of getting up to New York unless I drove or could hitch a ride on either one of the military aircraft that was going up there or not. So after having a debate over the phone, I'm asking him, what do you want? He said, Master Chief, I cannot tell you over the phone because you have to come and see it yourself. He said, Master Chief, I just got up off the ground from crying from what I just saw. You got to come up here. And I could tell in his voice that it was urgent. So I was able to just get in my car and drive to New York. Got to the Activities New York. They took me by boat over to where the Ground Zero area was. And then I was escorted over to Trinity Church. Now, mind you, when I saw Trinity Church, and I told you about the destruction and everything that was all around it, and knowing that it was going to take forever to clean that up, the place was spotless. Spotless. So then I understood what the senior chief meant, but I had to see it myself because there was no way I was going to believe what he said on the phone. So I looked at the senior chief and I said, what happened? He said, Master Chief, only thing I can tell you is that when we showed up and we started doing a couple of things, there were hundreds of people, recovery operations people, stopped what they were doing and they came over to this church. And before too long, there was no place to stand. There were hundreds of people here. Loaders coming to move stuff and so forth. He said, so in a matter of a day, 24 hours, it was clean. Destruction was all around the rest of that area, but Trinity Church became spotless. Admiral Lloyd knew what he was thinking about hope. Because if you saw that destruction and despair as we saw it, reality gives in and says, it just isn't going to work. This is, there's just so much that's happening, and the thinking about the nearly 3,000 lives lost and so forth and so on. But he was thinking about this church. Now, for those of you who follow faith, you probably will recognize that somewhere along the line, God was involved with this. And for whatever reason or belief that you have and you don't know what it's about, the truth of the matter is, I saw a miracle. And I saw a miracle that happened out of terror, out of destruction. And it was hope. And it was hope that once again reminded me of our service song about always being ready for the call. That's what we did on 9/11. And that's what we continue to do today. For what our roles and responsibilities are, for those who remain on active duty, retired civilians, and so forth, you're always ready for the call. You're always ready to do the work that's necessary. Because 9/11 is beyond us as far as a date that lived in infamy of terror, of hate, of destruction, of trying to tear down the pure fabric of our country. That's behind us. Because what's in front of us now is about the future. It's about freedom. It's about the protection of freedom. That's what we're all about. And that's why Semper Paratus is our guide. God bless you all. Semper Paratus.
That concludes this morning's observation. Dismissed.
All right, take care.
Thank you for asking.
Did you guys mess up the GoPro?